Welcome. Welcome to another episode of Becoming a Techno Wizard. And today we are continuing our series on my newsletter on Journal Techno Wizardry, in this edition of A New Story of Humanity. So last time we talked about how hierarchies always, oops, I magnified it, how hierarchies always collapse, right? And I mentioned a few things that we can see that like these are kind of fairly simple mechanisms that explains why many of these empires collapse. And I want to touch on this last one because I think there's a lot to say here that unfortunately I haven't really seen much of. So in this section, I'm going to talk about a brief tangent on Africa, 'cause I think it's a great, Africa is a great almost case study of why hierarchy is so dangerous, as it's such a, you know, problematic virus. All right. So it's this last one I want to touch on real quick in fighting in regards to Africa, the birthplace to humanity. Because Africa is an absolutely perfect example of the problem with hierarchies. Many people regard Africa today as a backwater shit country. You remember that, right? Obvious ignorance aside, this perfectly illustrates my point. Most people around the world, including many Africans, don't even know about the history of Africa. They just assume it has always been poor and miserable, that there is some intrinsic failure of the people that make it so. Once again, even many Africans believe this to this day, right? A lot of modern Africans across Nigeria and these other places, you hear them talking, in a very misanthropic way about their own people, like a very, self-hating way in terms of African society. Obviously, to anyone who knows African history, this is not true. Africa, even during colonialism, had hundreds of kingdoms, empires, and otherwise thriving societies. Here are a few you can look up yourself. The Mali Empire, birthplace of Mansa Musa, the richest man in history, even to this day, and the home of Timbuktu, which was the largest scholar city and library in Africa and the world for hundreds of years. It was like on par to the, if not greater in some instances, to the Great Library of Alexandria and stuff like that, right? The Edo Empire, or otherwise known as the Benin Kingdom, who used fractal math to organize their city, a fact that the Spaniards could not grasp and thought was chaotic or messy. Also, was the cleanest city they ever visited, including London or their own cities. You can look this up once again. Look up, the Edo Empire or the Benin Kingdom, what the Spaniards said about it. All right, you'll see stuff like, oh, this was one of the cleanest. They had the cleanest streets ever. Put London to shame, stuff like that. But they talked about how the streets didn't make much sense, and it wasn't until a couple hundred years later, or 100 years later, something like that, where they realized that Empire used fractal math to organize their city, so it wasn't chaotic or messy. It just made sense in their own way of designing, right? And it made sense for that context of designing these fractal maths, fractal methods of organizing. So what I mean by fractal is that you had like these little, kind of courtyards, right? Well, there's really a bunch of layers, so I might have to make a whole thing about this because I learned more about fractal math and how a lot of African places have used binary and fractal math for hundreds, if not thousands of years. It's part of the spiritual belief system. It's very interesting. But especially in Benin, they kind of perfected this where you had this like small courtyard, or really the house room, and then a bigger room, and then a courtyard, and each room kind of signified different people living there. So like the elder would be in this room, the kids would be in this room, the parents, or something like that. I might have that backwards, but you had like the generational, events or generational kind of thing here for each level of the fractal, right? And that went beyond the household. That was just with the household. You had the fractal household, and then you had a fractal kind of living kind of region, or not region, but like block, almost city block, right? Where you had this family was related to that family, and so they were in the same block, but this family was like a extended of the main family, and so you had that in a larger block, and then you had the extended family beyond them, right? And so that's how it fractaled out. And this whole thing was there was then uh based on like the different cultures, right? The different family groups. So these extended families were kind of one kind of family group, and there's another family group over there, another um kinship group over there, and all that kind of led up into the central king or queen, right? So they had, imagine like you have these small little courtyards and then a bigger city block and then a bigger region like a city region, and then all that kind of, all these lines centralize into the emperor who sits in the middle of everything, has like the biggest, piece. So it was very hierarchical, but it was also very complex, if you want to call it that, right? um and that's what the Spaniards didn't understand. They thought all streets were supposed to be straight or whatever, so they didn't really understand why all these, curves and all this other stuff was going on there. Anyway, Zimbabwe, which literally means Great Stone City, due to their massive walls and structures built with the huge stones that fit massively together with no mortar. So, even to this day, a lot of people don't understand how they were able to create these extremely precise walls with no mortar. It looks like they just stacked rocks on top, but they managed to create really precise walls and like turns and all that other stuff. We don't really know 100% how they did it. They erected trade routes throughout much of Africa and even with China via trade with coastal cities, which they did that through this next one, Swahili, which seemed to have used Persian architecture before the Persians and built their entire city from coral. From coral. From coral. Like, go look it up, man. It's amazing. They had massive sea-based trade networks and regularly traded with India and China. So these went out, how these were developed. Zimbabwe was actually a series of almost colonies across Central Africa, where you had like, it was extremely hierarchical, where you had like the king and queen lived on a mountain top, and then all the other people live kind of further away below the mountain, right? And this, they have found multiple like Zimbabwe's, like multiple kind of uh regions or cities, like many cities. I say many, but some of them weren't many. Some of them were small, some of them were not. But you see multiple of these cities all around Central Africa in a certain region. Um, and they indicate, not only did it happen through time, right? There's like, there's cities that were hundreds of years younger than other cities that looked the same, like had a very similar type of architecture of like the king and queen on the mountaintop and the others below, and then these walls made out of stones, with no mortar, right? They share all these things together, but they are several hundred years apart, right? But throughout, in those cities and in the ruins and stuff like that, you see like clay pots from China. You see freaking all these other things from India or other places that you like, how did that get there? And it wasn't just, and they can carbon date the things to see that it wasn't, brought there at a later point. No, it was there when the city, came to ruins. And so turns out that a lot of these Swahili folks, they had a massive trade network, and they traded with other parts of Africa, including on the coast was the Swahili folks, right? And the Swahili were very masterful, sea-based traders. So the Zimbabweans would have, whatever they have in the internal of the country, and then trade that with the Swahili people, and they would, trade that with the Indian, Chinese, and China people. So it was really interesting how all this massive trade networks worked throughout most of Africa. And you see this with the Kumite, the Nubia, so with Somalia, with Aksumite, etc. There's like tons of them out there. It's really amazing. Like Nubia is a really fascinating one because they went. Nubia is located just below Egypt, or in that really in that same region. And the Nubians often fought the Egyptians. All right, the Nubians were less hierarchical than most of these other places, and they often fought the Egyptians because the Egyptians were like the colonizers of the day. They were always trying to take over and grow their empire. And the Nubians were like, nah, man, we don't like that. And so they would often raid the Egyptians and push them all the way back up the Nile, to the point where the Egyptians used to call these Nubians devils or whatever, because it kept getting smacked. It kept getting smacked up by the Nubians. And so, um, that some people are saying might be one reason why the depictions of like black people, of darker colored people, were almost racist in a way, even though Egyptians were technically black, like they were not white or anything like that. People would love to claim that, but really the Egyptians were technically more Middle Eastern-ish because they were, at that central location where they traded with a lot of the Middle Easterns. But the Nubians were not, right? They were more of a darker skin color, and they traded very often with the sub-Saharans, with people, south of Sahara. But the Nubians, they weren't pushovers. They weren't like some, whatever. Like they were just as powerful as the Egyptians. They would smack them up all the time for hundreds of years, maybe even thousands of years. Like this was a huge, problem, a huge clash throughout history. And so the fact that we don't know this is very, very problematic. Anyways, furthermore, the Greeks and Romans regularly sent their best to learn amongst the African scholars. Again, I don't know why this is not mentioned much. Thus, the close integration with Egypt. Like people mention, like, oh yeah, the Greeks and Romans, they conquered Egypt, or they went over to Egypt, but people don't realize what that actually means. Is that these Greeks and Romans that a lot of the Europeans love to base their entire culture on, most of their culture was from Africa. Was it like precisely from Egypt, and even to some extent like further south, because Egypt was the trade for much of the sub-Saharan, literature and scholar and inventions and things like that to come north, right? That was the only way to the north, for many of them, unless they were able to figure out sea routes. So the idea that, these Greeks and Romans, were just purely European, knowledge is just doesn't really make sense in terms of history. Anyways, um, yeah, who were more than just Egyptians, but folks throughout from all throughout Africa and the Middle East, since it's a prime central place to meet. But during colonialism, as Europeans began to invade Africa, the biggest reason all these empires fell was actually not purely due to the Europeans, because many of them were able to fight them off quite, for quite a while, even despite guns, ships, and disease. And there's the famous Jared Diamond book that I was just looking at. Um, was it Guns, Germs, and Steel, that kind of posits that. I haven't read the book myself, so I might be wrong. But as I understand it, he's positing that Africa was taken over because Europeans had superior gunships and or gunships and diseases, and it was kind of like happenstance due to Europeans' better access to agriculture and stuff like that, that allowed them to develop this sort of technology. But that's not necessarily true, because a lot of, from what I understand, a lot of across a lot of Africa, they also had very advanced um, weaponry. Maybe not ships. Well, some of them did have ships, like once again the Swahili, and there were some on the west coast, I believe. Um, Even the Carthaginians, however you say that, a lot of them were actually African in origin, stuff like that. The Moors, they were often colonizing half of Europe, so like it wasn't very. It's not like so clear cut that the Europeans had superior technology or anything like that. And furthermore, like their use of disease, a lot of that was like on purpose, where they would send their sick blankets, like their influenza filled blankets, to the Africans, and they would it was basically biological warfare, right? Which is terrible. But either way, it wasn't that clear. Like it wasn't that easy for them to take over. And many of these battles they fought, many of the Africans won. Right, even with the European, ships and guns, because remember, many of those guns were not that great to start with. Like you had one shot, and then you had to load them up or something like that, or there's a lot of just nuance here, right? It's just not so clear. What actually happened is if we continue here, what killed these huge African powers was their own infighting. The same thing that took down the Greeks, Romans, Ottomans, Aztecs, Japanese, and almost every other great empire. People were vying for power within said empires, many of which thought they could use the European slave trade routes or weaponry to gain that power and stab their own kin in the back. Right? Again, this is something that we see in almost every single culture around the world. Right? They thought that they would be able to take advantage of the changing times to make a bid for power. Some were successful, but most weren't. Even those who were successful only lasted a few more decades before infighting plus external pressures caused them to fold. Now, I don't know, I don't think I mentioned the exact examples, but a big example is the Benin Kingdom, right? They were one of the biggest kingdoms across Africa for a long time, and they fell to infighting, right? They had this whole thing where the Spaniards came down, they were looking at their cities, and they were like, "Oh yeah, let's trade." Now and then it had a schism, right? Because some of them were like, "No, don't mess with these folks. We have our own business to do." But some of them were like, "You know what? I want to, invade this land." And the Spaniards, they'll be able to help, right? If I take some of their ships, I'll be able to go up this river and take that town that I was never able to take before, stuff like that. Or I'm what if I can use their guns and I can make my own army so I don't have to depend on the king's army and stuff like that. So they were, over there plotting like people do. And that's a lot of the reason why these empires fell, because they were, plotting against themselves. And at the same time, because they were still hierarchical, right? You had rebels, you had people on the lower class who were like, we don't like none of this. We don't care about the Spaniards or none of y'all niggas. All y'all, in the way, all y'all, keeping us down. Let's do something about it. So you had all these things, happening. A great example of this, which I didn't mention here and I just read about recently, is the Inca and the Aztecs. This happened across America, right? What people don't realize is that the Aztecs and the Incas were extremely hierarchical. Like we know that they sacrificed humans, right? Like the Aztecs, but what we don't talk about is why. Is because they were extremely hierarchical. They had like this god king, who basically could do whatever they want, and so their empires were extremely um, you know classes, right? You had a huge amount of people at the bottom and a few people at the top. And so as soon as they had an opportunity, which was when the Spaniards came or when the Europeans came, the people at the bottom saw this as an opportunity to fight back against the god kings and things like that. They were trying to use the Europeans in order to gain freedom, right? And of course that bit them in the back. But the point here is that it was due to this infighting, it was due to this fact that you already had hierarchy and people were trying to break that hierarchy. And the Europeans were just came at the perfect time to add into that problem. Who the Europeans, of course, a lot of them were also extremely hierarchical. So it was just feeding into the whole mess. These African empires fell due to their own hands first, then the outsiders burned everything to the ground and claimed that land for themselves. Now, most of us don't even remember that there ever was anything happening in Africa at all. We just assume it has always been this way, which is so stupid and unfortunate and racist. Look at America now, or wherever you live. Look at the infighting. Look at how even with an existential crisis knocking at the door, that is climate change, pandemics, and possibly even the singularity, like robots taking over and shit like that, right? AI. Most of the people in power are just trying to grasp at more power rather than address these problems. Like we see that now with the left and the right, on the Republicans and the Democrats. They're both the same. It's just the lesser of the lesser evil, right? And yeah, I agree that we can't, a lot of these, like, I'm sorry, but a lot of these conservatives, they just not even conservative. They're just downright authoritarian. But at the same time, a lot of the quote unquote left is not really left. They're just authoritarians with some leftish veneer, right? It's not even. Anyways, our entire society is about to be colonized by nature itself. The elements will claim the land we thought we owned. All of the traces of our civilization will be ground to dust with even more prejudice than the Europeans did to Africa. Because when these, volcanoes start happening, or when these tsunamis start coming around and stuff like that, these big storms, what do you think is going to happen to all this massive, amazing technologies and buildings that we have? So tell me, what value is our progress, our wealth, our democracy, our civilization if it all can go and will go up in smoke under the weight of its own corruption? Think about that. So yeah, I'll end it there. I was talking a lot this time. Next time we'll get into hierarchies, like it's like cancer, right? We're gonna really break down this hierarchy is a disease thing. But yeah, I hope this has given you yet more things to look at and think about. Again, please do your research. Like, go look up these empires, go look up some other ones, and realize that Africa, it was amazing. Like, they had a lot of stuff going on, right? But we don't see that now. So if you think about that and realize like where you are today, with how Europe is today, with how America is today, how China is today, how Russia is today, then think about what happens when all these empires inevitably collapse. We think our ancestors, if they're still alive, right, will look back and see. in 100 years, a couple hundred years, 1,000 years? You think they're gonna see all this stuff that we created and be like, "Oh yeah, they were amazing"? Like, no. If there's no, if there's another empire at that time, they're gonna completely just say none of this existed. They say they're the new stuff now. Like there's never been anything like them before, even though they're probably like similar to where we are now. Like it's really unfortunate that we have this idea of a linear history where things are just getting better when in reality is really really not like that. But anyways, I'll end it there. As always, thanks for watching, thanks for listening. Let me know your thoughts. We can have a discussion about this stuff in the comments below, and keep thinking, keep being critical. Have a great day. See ya.